We've seen over the past several years, really past several decades, a decline in the stigma related to people approaching issues of mental health. And that is generally a good thing. It means more and more people can get the help they need and live happier, more stable lives. But there is a downside to this growing interest and focus on mental health in this country. That inward focus that comes from it is weakening our democracy, our society, and our economy. That is the bold claim that got my attention a couple months ago when I received an email from the Archbridge Institute. That email announced a new initiative called the Head Out Initiative that focused on mental health, but not in the way that I expected. For the first time that I can remember, it created a bridge between the discussion of mental health and the discussion of our health as a nation and as an economy. So today we're going to unpack that diagnosis with its author, Dr. Clay Routledge. Clay is a trained research psychologist and the COO at Archbridge Institute, where he leads the Human Flourishing Lab and this new Head Out initiative. So Clay, welcome to my podcast couch, where we will unpack all of this. How have the discussions around mental health changed broadly over the past few decades?
I started my career in psychology really working in outpatient mental health before I decided to pursue an academic career, which was what I did before joining the Archbridge Institute. I worked in outpatient mental health facility, and we were working with like severely ill people with schizophrenia, people with major bipolar disorder. And this was very much thought of as a organic brain disease, people who really had a difficult time functioning in society and needed a lot of intervention. At that time, which was over 25 years ago, we were definitely starting to see more general attention being paid to mental health as something that doesn't just affect the severely ill, but everyone. But at that time, there was still, I think, this real separation of people who are really, really suffering deeply from mental illness, and it's disrupting their ability to function in society. And those who are just having more ordinary bouts of sadness or stress or anxiety. That perspective has started to change over the years. And so now more and more we're seeing our culture, our institutions, even psychologists talking about mental illness in a more general way, as if it's, conflating these more ordinary bouts of distress with more severe forms of illness. And so that has led to what's sometimes referred to as concept creep, which is the broadening of our definitions of specific concepts. And it's been, I think, for the most part, well-intentioned, because the idea is that, well, there's lots of people who are suffering unnecessarily and would benefit from some type of intervention. And I think that's part of the story for sure. But another part of the story is unfortunate, which is unlike heart disease or cancer or other types of health conditions where you generally think just bringing more attention to them is good, right? Because it's going to have people go get the types of early detection tests that might be useful, or it's going to help them do the types of preventative activities that might help them not develop a certain condition. Mental illness is this weird category in which it's more centrally mediated through how we think and how we feel. And so you can't really wish your way or think your way into having most physical health diseases, right? But you can actually think in certain patterns that make you more likely to develop depression. So that's the challenge, is more awareness when it comes to mental health can be good, but it also has this potential where it can put people on a path towards a type of thinking and behavior that actually increases their risk of developing a mental illness that they would have otherwise not had.
Now, people who have listened to this Giving Ventures podcast for a while say, okay, wait a minute, we're talking about mental health. This is a podcast that usually talks about philanthropy, that usually talks about free markets and liberty stuff. What the heck's going on here? So let's make that bridge here. I was reading some different things that you've written in preparation for this, and one of the lines that jumped out to me was you say, psychology is upstream of freedom, prosperity, and progress, which is a bold claim that, basically we don't, without figuring out the psychology piece, we don't get the freedom, the prosperity, progress piece. And you've connected these declines in mental health to these declines in freedom and human progress. build that bridge for us.
So ask yourself where do the ideas that build the foundation of classical liberalism, free markets, free societies come from? Well, they come from people, right? And so they come from human brains. The institutions that we build, the free markets that we build, the entrepreneurial and endeavors that lead to economic growth and prosperity are driven by human beings, and human beings are psychological. And so, to me, it's the case is somewhat obvious, but at the same time, you have to think in more detail. Well, what does that mean? So, I work from what's a motivational, like it's kind of a motivational brain model of how you can think about how humans engage with the world. And the simplest way to think about it is you can think about like what I call like defense motivation, which is when we feel threatened at that, in the environment, that's the time to kind of become more vigilant, to narrow our focus, to pull back a little bit, and because we want to protect what we have. Right? We're seeking security. When you can contrast that with what we call growth motivation, which is we want to go out and expand. We want to build. And both are important because you need if you're always just constantly trying to grow, trying to develop, try new things, explore, innovate, then sometimes you're not providing a good security. If you're always focused on security, well, then you're never going to expand and grow. So both of these things are pretty important. But the problem is when we feel threatened and the threat's not real, then we're in this defensive mindset that's making us see the world through a more hostile, through a lens that doesn't really lend itself to the type of openness and creativity and innovation that freedom requires. And that's kind of what's happening when you have more people that are reporting anxiety, for instance. Then you're also having more people saying the world's not really a safe place. And the world's not real. And just to be more concrete about it, there's a lot of different research showing that, for instance, anxiety is a big predictor of social trust. Social trust is generally good for entrepreneurship, right? And for democratic stability. So if you have more people saying they're anxious all the time, then that leads to lower social trust, which tends to lead, it can be more complicated than this, of course, but it tends to lead towards more of a disposition of people can't be trusted, and so we need more government oversight. We need more government regulation. And so there was some research, for instance, in the COVID-19 pandemic in Europe, showing that the more people that were experiencing, anxiety, fear during that time, understandably, which, what was going on with the pandemic, the people who experienced the most fear were also subsequently the most likely to support civil liberty restrictions. And so you can see this relationship between our own mental states and our general view of the world. And if you see the world as a more threatening, unsafe, perilous place, then in general, speaking in generalities here, you're more likely to seek security over liberty.
So is that to say that this increase in anxiety diagnosis, are they wrong? Like, is it a bunch of people who have just been over-labeled and misdiagnosed, or is it true, but the therapeutic response has been wrong?
I think both are true and in a self-reinforcing way. Oh, and I should have added before, and the previous note, just to add, another big element that we work on is hope. So people who are more hopeful, people who look to the future and see possibility, and that we have the capacity to improve the world, they're more likely to be entrepreneurs. They're more likely to work with other people across differences to try to solve problems. So hope is a very progress-oriented, abundance-oriented mindset. And poor mental health is a big barrier to hope. In fact, poor mental health is a key driver of hopelessness. Like people who are severely depressed and anxious, they look to the future and they see a dark future, and that's not good for a free and flourishing society. But to the current question, it's both and it's self-reinforcing. And what I mean by that is it's definitely true that if you go back to like the early 1950s when the first diagnostic statistical manual for mental illness was developed, I think there were somewhere around 100 conditions and 100 disorders. And if you go to the present day, it's more like 300. And so over time, what you're seeing is this expansion of what counts as a disorder and the number of disorders and the clinical threshold for something counting as a disorder. So we've definitely expanded what something like anxiety is now, and that's part of it. But at the same time, it's true that with better treatments, with more mental health awareness campaigns, there are people who were previously suffering who weren't getting interventions that are now getting them. So some of it is like we're actually are capturing more people who are experiencing disorders. But the problem with the first category, just expanding it, is, and this has become a real issue with social media because a lot of people are getting their mental health information from social media and it's inaccurate. It's not evidence based. It's more of like it's more vibes. And so what's happening there that can actually make it to where we end up with more people who actually have these disorders is that they get this information online. They're like, oh, lots of people seem to have an anxiety disorder. Yeah, sometimes I actually feel pretty anxious and I'm pretty stressed out at work. And sometimes I don't know how to be and everything feels overwhelming. Maybe I have an anxiety disorder. And when you start to integrate that idea into your sense of self, you start to behave like somebody with an anxiety disorder. And one of the problems with anxiety disorders is when people have them, they're avoidant of the things that make them productive in life. And avoidance is self-fulfilling. Like if something makes you anxious and so now you avoid it, you become more worried about encountering that experience. And so you avoid it more. And so even just by starting to think of yourself or entertaining the idea that maybe you have an anxiety disorder can put you on the path to developing one, which of course would then actually increase the percentage of people who actually have anxiety disorders, but not for these more, typical reasons that we would used to think they developed them, but more because of the self-reinforcing loop, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that does make sense. And so, I mean, we always, whenever there's a problem like this, we want to find somebody to blame. You have an article out this week in the New York Times that I thought was very good called Stop Pathologizing Ordinary Life, which the title itself I think is great. But you talk about some of the different nexuses of how this came about. I mean, social media, you just talked about. Where do we put blame for this? I think we like blame because then we think maybe we can flip a switch, but maybe it's blame is the wrong way to think about it.
Yeah. Well, first, thank the New York Times for the title. I didn't come up with it, but it is a great title. At some level, this might seem like an easy answer, the easy answer, but at some level we're all to blame. And what I mean by that is there isn't just one thing that has contributed to this. And I think that a constructive way to think about blame is we're all to blame in the sense that I think most people obviously want those who are suffering to have, to not suffer mentally. And another way to more generally blame to blame us all is part of this seems to be a function of affluence and abundance. So it's a success story that that America's a rich country and people are now less worried about basic survival needs, basic physical safety, and so that's allowed us to spend more time focusing on our inner lives and thinking about that type of mental suffering. It's hard to get too worried about someone's sadness or anxiety if you can't put food on the table. And so some of it is a story of success there. Some of it is technological, not in the sense that I don't think we should blame social media for everything, but it is definitely true that if you have these cultural ideas that end up being counterproductive, now they're much easier to spread through technology. And this is what we're seeing on a lot of social media platforms is that a lot of young people in particular, that's where they're getting the information about mental health. And there is research on this showing that the more people get their information from social media about mental illness, the less accurate their knowledge about mental health is. And so there's a lot of misinformation online. And again, I don't think it's necessarily the case that there's a bunch of bad actors here. It's just more this has kind of happened. And then on top of that, you can think about, and other people like Jonathan Haidt, and Jean Twenge have talked about this, which is the decline in free play in childhood. So we might have kids that are becoming more vulnerable to psychological disorders because they're not developing the resilience that maybe they did in the past. Jean Twenge has talked about how families are getting smaller. So when you have fewer kids, you spend more time focused. If you just have one child, you're a bit more obsessive and worried about them, and that might reduce their resilience. So some of these things are real issues, I think, in society that we're grappling with. That no one person's to blame. The idea of concept creep has been, the scholars who have done the most work on that have suggested that, or have proposed at least, that has something to do with kind of a liberal society becoming more sensitive to harm. And, and again, some of that and they've said that very agnostically. They're not trying to say, oh, liberalism's bad. But the idea is that as we become more sensitive to harm, as we've already discussed, on the one hand, it means we have opportunities to potentially reduce suffering, but it also means we might unintentionally increase suffering by becoming like too hypervigilant, too sensitive, and overly focused. So that's a long way of saying I think there's lots of potential sources of blame, but I think that the way to think about this constructively is that also means there's a lot of people who care about mental health. So it's not one of those issues that's the problem's getting worse because we're neglecting it. It has the irony over like the problem's getting worse because we almost saying care too much is not quite right. But we're almost focused on it in a way that shows that we're well intentioned, but maybe we're going about it the wrong way. And the reason I think it's constructive to think that way is we already have, people are already on board generally with the idea that this is an important issue. And so then to me, what we need to do is bring people together to say, yes, this is an important issue, but we're going about it in a way that's counterproductive. We need to find a way to approach improving mental health without being so obsessed and preoccupied with it.
Yeah, so many of the things that lead to a degradation of freedom, of individual liberties, etc., often are these well-meaning things. It's how we just want to make sure people are safe, and so then you get regulations and taxes and subsidies when it doesn't work, and so it swings wildly other way. Just, the more you tinker with it, the more it actually eats away at that prosperity that you're wanting. And so it's interesting that mental health could kind of be the same way. I want to get into some of the solutions, but one more question on the problem, which is just the age demographic of this. And we talked about some of this in the article too. How much of this is a product and problem of Gen Z or millennials? Where are we seeing it?
Yeah, we're definitely seeing it the most with the younger generations. And so even if you just look at surveys, which we've done a bunch of these at Archbridge, and of course there's other lots of other surveys too. If you ask people about the current state of their mental health, young people, Gen Z in particular, are much more likely to describe themselves as having poor mental health compared to older generations. So it's, Gen Z reports the highest levels of mental distress, and then millennials, and then it kind of goes down, and you get all the way up to older adults, and they report much better mental health. Maybe for a variety of reasons, but one of them does seem to be what we've talked about, which is this cultural transition to a more like inward focused, like, mental health preoccupied culture. And the young adults are the most likely to be involved in that. In addition to that, are some of the other factors that might really, like we've talked about, that might really represent more real vulnerabilities to mental health conditions, such as like overprotective parenting, which is a predictor of anxiety disorders. So, this is part of the free play movement idea, right? Like kids need to develop resilience. They need to be out there doing things on their own, and that helps them build the psychological fortitude that protects them, or at least, helps protect them from developing psychopathology as they age. And so again, that's something that's happened in more recent decades. So I'd say both on the sides of actual vulnerabilities to poor mental health and the types of like preoccupation with mental health that we've been talking about, both those things make younger generations more vulnerable.
So we live in a society where we're more anxious and we recognize that as a clinical thing, and so it becomes a self-perpetuating thing, and another mental health diagnoses as well. But you aren't just sitting around identifying this problem. You're actually working to create a solution, which is what we're all about at Donor Trust. And with Giving Ventures, we like solutions. So talk to us about the Head Out initiative. And first, big picture, tell us what Archbridge Institute is, because it's still relatively new. People may not know as much about it, but doing some great work.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Archbridge Institute is a nonpartisan think tank that focuses on three pillars of what we've identified as three pillars of human flourishing: economics, psychology, and culture. So a lot of people are, probably familiar with the economic sides of things, which is really focused, and our work is really focused on removing barriers to flourishing. So things like occupational licensing. So we focus on issues like social mobility, economic freedom, kind of, what you would expect in the classical liberal space of economics. But we also, take this more holistic approach, which is life is more than just that. And especially if you think about barriers, there are real regulatory barriers to people flourishing. But sometimes the barrier is inside us, right? The barrier isn't the government. You can imagine an ideal regulatory situation in which people have all the opportunities, all the freedom that you can imagine to pursue their ambitions, but don't have the motivation to do so, or don't have the ideas. And so really adding that psychology piece to it for us is to say that there are external barriers, there are external like regulatory barriers, but there are also internal psychological barriers. And that also connects to our third pillar, culture, because a lot of the times the internal barriers and some of the external ones as well, of course, are shaped by culture and like our broader cultural narratives and attitudes. So we really wanted to focus on all three of those things. And I think critically to see these things as not independent, but highly interrelated. And in fact, I think this goes both directions. You can think about regulatory barriers being really demoralizing at the psychological level and demotivating. But you can also think about psychology and culture as shaping the regulatory environment. So if you have a culture of high trust, if you have a culture in which we celebrate entrepreneurs' success and stories, then that will energize people psychologically and promote more hope. But it'll also promote people to vote for the types of candidates and policies that will that will support the environment of aspiration and growth. And so that's just to say we see all of these things as connected. I'm a psychologist by training. I was a psychology professor and business professor for many years before joining the Archbridge Institute. And I joined to really help in this expansion of thinking more about psychology and culture. And we've done a lot of work in that space on topics like meaning in life, hope, agency, things that we think are critical psychological ingredients of a free and flourishing society. But more recently, we really wanted to focus more specifically on this mental health issue because if you look over the past several decades, as we noted earlier, there's just been a growth, a dramatic increase in the percentage of Americans who report that they're in poor mental health. And poor mental health is very much connected to the kind of agentic, hopeful mindset, as we've discussed, that's critical for not just freedom to sustain and promote freedom, but also for freedom to turn into flourishing. Because, like I said, you can have a free society, and no one's super motivated to do anything, and then that's going to undermine freedom. Because eventually, when if people aren't doing anything, they're going to start looking to the government to solve their problems. And so we said, well, here's a specific issue that's a growing concern for our country, mental health. Let's focus on it. And as you pointed out, and I'm glad you did, it's one thing to say, oh, here's the problem. We have a culture that's become obsessed, or overly preoccupied with mental health. And in a way, we're talking ourselves into being less mentally healthy, which is a challenge. But then what do you do about that? And so the reason we call this project Head Out is because it turns out, and this isn't just something like we're making up, this isn't some kind of marketing pitch. It turns out there's a ton of empirical evidence that some of the best ways to improve your mental health are to spend less time thinking about it and to get out in the world and do things. So that's the idea. Head out and get out of your head and head out into the world. So just as one example, physical exercise, it turns out now we have large volumes of empirical evidence um, indicating that physical exercise is as effective, if not more effective, than traditional psychotherapy and pharmacological interventions for treating depression and anxiety. So it's not that no one needs these more traditional interventions. It's just that for most people, most of the time, they're going to get as much value and as much recovery and positive mental health from engaging in physical exercise as they are from going to see a clinician or from taking antidepressants.
Now the Head Out initiative has 5 different categories. Physical exercise is one of them. Kind of quickly, let's go through the others just to help people ground themselves in what are these solutions that are actually out there.
Yeah. So yeah, the first one we talked about, we just call move, which is whether you're running, lifting weights, in a fitness class, anything that really gets you, and there's a lot of physiological mediators of that particular mechanism, but really, I think a lot of this is exercise it helps break the cycle of rumination and anxiety. It gets you out of your head. Any of these activities have shown that you don't have to be a gym rat. You don't have to be training for a marathon. It turns out that even, relatively low levels of physical exercise are really beneficial for psychological health. So move is one. Work is another one. Work is, there's been research showing, for instance, that people who lose their jobs, it's a source of psychological distress, obviously not surprisingly. And so people who are experiencing work-related depression or anxiety, one of the best interventions to improve their mental health back to baseline is to get another job, right? So productive work. And the third is we call create, which is, these are the types of hobbies, even businesses, entrepreneurial activities, self-expressions that allow you to do something that's directing your attention towards something creative. And of course, there's lots of different ways to do that. Connect is the fourth one, which is about social relationships. And then, which is, and just a quick note on social relationships, because I think this is something that's sometimes misunderstood. Relationships aren't just about being around people. Connection isn't just about people even being nice to you or kind to you. Really, what fulfills this deep sense of connection is the sense that you matter, that you actually have an important role to play in a relationship. So you can actually be surrounded by people and feel quite lonely. And it turns out loneliness isn't just about your social environment. It's about the role you play in it. So connection is a very agentic thing. And then finally, the last category is transcend, which is really the more spiritual and a religious dimension of flourishing. And again, it's not just about kind of proving the point or helping prove the point that this is really about getting out of your head. It's not just about, I have this religious belief or this spiritual belief. It's the people who are actively participating in religious communities or who engaged in the types of activities where they're channeling their spiritual beliefs into productive actions that get the most benefit from their religious faith. And of course, all these, we're separating these things, but of course they're all interrelated. Like a lot of times it's your work environment that provides you with the types of social relationships that are useful or that gives you opportunities to engage in creative work. Exercise is we often enjoy more, or it's particularly rewarding if we're doing it with other people. And so you can imagine all these things as interconnected. But the point is, across these 5 domains of human activity, what really helps people mentally flourish is that you're getting out of your head and you're focusing your attention on a project, a task, a relationship, a job, a faith tradition, something that's not you worrying about yourself, but actively involved in making a difference in the world and being a significant member of a family and a community and a workplace.
So none of these are a pill. I can't just pop these. I can't fix it overnight. It's not some miracle drug. These things take work, right? Finding fulfilling work
Hmm.
I may hate my job, so I got to redirect it. That takes work. Obviously, getting off the couch and starting to move. If you haven't been doing that takes work. I mean, it all takes work. And some people don't like work. How do you?
That's
Uh,
right.
so what is the prescription, doctor? Like, how do we? You've written this out. This is what we should do. What are
Hmm.
what are you? What is Archbridge? What should other groups or donors or somebody be doing to help people swallow this non-pill?
Yeah. Yeah. So the first thing, and this is something, this head out initiative, which we launched, the first step I really think is like getting the word out, because what you said, that this requires work. Um, a lot of people do think if they're feeling down or if they're feeling stressed, that there should be a simple solution. It should be just, well, I just go see my therapist, or I can just pop a pill. And so I think, and I think a lot of younger people in particular, the way that mental health is being talked about to them, it's not treated as, well, this is something, life is difficult, life is challenging, and that's good. You have to work hard to feel mentally good. And it's not just the default that you're going to be a well-adjusted human, that you have to work at this. And so I think part of this is just getting the word out there, and increasing awareness. And so that's one of the things you mentioned, the New York Times article that I wrote is, that's a good example of something. Like, lots of people read the New York Times, and it's like, oh, people can see this perspective, and then be like, oh yeah, um, maybe we should rethink how we approach mental health. You're seeing this in schools. I mean, there's now been a fair amount of research that's come out that I hopefully is getting schools to rethink how they approach mental health. And what this research has found is there's been a number of schools, particularly in places like the UK and Australia, where basically they're like, we're just going to give all the students, it's called universal treatment. We're going to give all the students in our classes mental health interventions. And thankfully, researchers decided to study this and the efficacy of this. And what they found is, not only was it ineffective, but it actually made kids' mental health worse. And so you took a bunch of people that didn't have mental illness, and maybe there's a few kids in the class that do, but instead of surgically targeting them for intervention, you give, it seems like, oh, this is the easy way to do this, is we'll just give everyone the intervention. And it made all the other students start to think in ways that were really unproductive and focus more on their, oh, I did feel sad today. My feelings were hurt today. Or maybe I have this problem. It's unfortunate that this that this was done in the first place, but at least there was good evidence documenting it. And now, you're starting to see a lot more people say, oh, okay, well, maybe that was well intentioned, but it's a bad approach. So I think that's the first thing that needs done, is we need to change the cultural attitude around mental health and mental health awareness in a way, again, that this isn't a backwards looking sentiment, because I think this is one of the challenges, is it's easy for people to misunderstand what I'm saying and to say, well, Clay thinks everyone's fine, and we should go back to mental illness being stigmatized, and no one should talk about their feelings or anything like that. And it's just like, that's not what I'm saying. What we're saying is, um, it's good that we've made progress and we've improved accessibility to interventions, and that we've improved the quality of these interventions. But we're also doing something that's unhealthy, and we're making the problem worse. And nobody wants that, presumably. And so we need to figure out how to thread the needle, really, between still having a supportive environment where people who perhaps are really suffering can get treatment they need. Because keep in mind, there's a lot of people who die by suicide, for instance, who never got any mental health treatment. And so it's still the case that there are people that are not getting the help they need. And there are people grappling with very, very severe brain disorders. Um, but most people, thankfully, that's not their situation. And so we need to think about we need to think about that more productively. And that's why I think what I like about um, this head out approach is, we're saying, it's almost like thinking about preventative medicine. We're saying, there's a lot of things people can just do for themselves that don't require going to seeking out a therapist, or looking for pharmacological interventions. There's a lot of things people can do for themselves. When you get that message out there and you realize, well, these are things people can do for themselves, then the prescription becomes pretty, you have to have the motivation to do it. But these aren't things that are like difficult for people to access. Like anyone can work out. It doesn't require a fancy gym membership or equipment. It's something that's very accessible to anyone. Um,
How different is this from
mhm.
cognitive behavioral therapy? And that just may be my ignorance showing through, but isn't that the point of something like that, of CBT, to uh, connect you to reality, essentially?
Yeah. So, um, yes, it, for the most part, I would say one of the most successful aspects of CBT is what's called behavioral activation, which is basically this idea of head out. Part of the problem with issues like anxiety is people get stuck in this feedback loop of negative thinking. And so, what a good therapist does is say, in the next, let's say 24 weeks or whatever, we're going to have this very specific treatment plan that helps you get out of your head and go do the activities that are fulfilling. And so, and some people do need that intervention. And if you go to our website, headoutworld.org, we have a toolkit that helps people decide whether or not they need a therapist, when they should seek one out, how they should seek one out. Because that's another thing is, unfortunately, there's a lot of therapy out there that's not evidence-based. And so it's not just the case that all therapists are the same. There are some therapists that use these more empirically validated methods where it really is about like, how do you get people back to good mental health so they can function on their own? And so someone shouldn't necessarily be in therapy forever, for instance. These are interventions that can have specific timelines for where you should be, but they require you. A good therapist will tell you this is going to require a lot of work, to your previous point, that this isn't just something that happens when you see the therapist once a week. You have to go out there and do difficult things. And so, yeah, there are aspects of CBT and other therapeutic interventions that are very much about this. And so that's great. And some people, that's what they need. Um, but but most people don't need that. And in our toolkit, you can, which is on our website, you can go through different steps, and it can be like, oh, if this is me, then I'm in this area. Then here's the things I can do for myself. Sometimes it's actually just a wait and see approach, because you might be experiencing some symptoms that seem like maybe you have a mental illness, but in reality, they'll go away in a couple of weeks, especially if you engage in these types of activities. So I think one thing that should be unifying about this head out approach is that it's something that anyone can do, like it's agency. And so for instance, sometimes you'll see people on the political left saying, well, we have all these mental health problems and we're not spending enough money on it. And where we can meet people where they are and meet people halfway, perhaps, is say, well, there's a lot of things that don't cost that much that much money. Actually, they don't cost any money. They're things that people can do for themselves. And so I think it's a very empowering message to especially young people, who I think increasingly feel like they um, they have to go through some type of intervention to feel good about life. And it's like, no, actually, you have a lot more power than you realize. And this doesn't just apply to mental health. This applies to lots of aspects of their lives.
Are you hearing from folks? I mean, you have this New York Times article, as you said, it's read by a lot of people. I can imagine a pile of hate mail coming in from people saying it's not that easy, Clay. Uh, have you heard things, positive or negative?
I've received dozens of emails from clinicians, from psychologists, um, very positive response. And they're like, this is an issue we actually deal with ourselves. We have a lot of people that, seeking mental health services that, don't really need them. And also, I think one of the challenges is for psychologists who are sensitive to this issue, is there's just a lot of misinformation online. And just like, just like most doctors they don't want they don't want their patients to be sicker. Psychologists don't want a society that's full of more mentally unhealthy people. So I think they are really worried about misinformation and this culture of where mental illness is almost becoming like like a trendy, promoted as like a trendy thing. And for just, as one example, there's some research showing that if people look at social media influencers who are sharing their mental health concerns and what's called normalizing. If you have an influencer saying something like, "Oh, I have an anxiety disorder," and it turns out this is really, lots of people have anxiety disorders. That kind of normalizing increases the likelihood that one of their followers will like that person and identify with them and say, "Oh, maybe I have a mental health disorder." So psychologists are concerned about that for sure. And so the response has been overwhelmingly positive, not just from psychologists, but I've also received a lot of emails from teachers and employers, saying that they're dealing with these issues. So, I'm sure there are negative negative comments that there always are, but in terms of the people who actually went that extra step to not just comment online, but to reach out to me and send me an email, they've all been really positive. And so again, I think this is an encouraging or a constructive step, is like a lot of people are starting to realize, I think, that this has become an issue. And it's also and for those who are really deeply concerned about people suffering with mental illness, uh, um, they're also worried about this because this directs resources away from those that are most in need. And so, like I noted earlier, there are people who engage in self-harm or who die by suicide that never sought out or received any mental health treatment. And so the more people that are seeing themselves as mentally ill, then the less attention I think the people who are most severely suffering receive. And so I think that's a unifying concern too, is we want mental illness to be taken seriously. And if we pathologize ordinary life, that trivializes it in a way, if that makes sense. So people will become more dismissive of it, and then that'll end up harming the people that are most vulnerable. So I think there's a lot of people who have a lot of different beliefs, a lot of different politics, a lot of different economic beliefs, who this is an issue that maybe they can find some common ground on. We're connecting this to free markets, of course, and other economic issues that we care about. But even for people who have no interest in that stuff, I think they are interested generally in Americans being mentally healthy.
A more stable society, one that has that social trust where people feel that agency, leads to better communities, people working together, solving problems together, less demand for government, more ability to go out and do cool stuff. I think it's like I
Yeah.
said from at the top, it's a fascinating bridge. It's a connection I've never really thought about, but so much of our attention and conversation gets taken up by these mental health things, and if we can correct them and help people. I mean, as you've reiterated here, this is not because nobody's suffering. It is because we are sometimes over pathologizing real issues that some people do have, and at the detriment of our own society. So it's fascinating stuff. I think it's right for Archbridge Institute to take this on. It's great for you to be sucked out of clinical world to come work in this world and help other people understand this. And I hope the response continues to be very positive. So, Clay Routledge, thank you so much.
Thank you, Peter. Appreciate it. And thank you for giving me the time to talk about this project.
Well, as Clay explained, we have become very focused in this country on mental health, perhaps to the point of being overly preoccupied with it. And of course, we want people to get the help that they need. That's important, but we also don't want it to become, as the New York Times headline put it, to a point where we're pathologizing normal life. The answers Clay brings up are, in theory, pretty simple. It's pretty straightforward. Go outside, engage with the transcendent, talk to other people. And it's actually a little bit similar to some of the things, if you've heard Arthur Brooks speak lately, former head of AEI. It's similar themes. There's clearly something to this. And I'm glad Clay has gotten some positive feedback from the mental health practitioner community, validates these ideas, shows that they really are true. And as Archbridge's research shows, all of this does connect to our ability to thrive, to be economically free as a nation, to take comfort in the constitutional rights that we have. And so this topic does connect directly back to a lot of things we often talk about here on Giving Ventures. Well, if you'd like to learn more about Archbridge Institute's work or Clay's, you can go to the Head Out Initiative website at headoutworld.org or go to archbridgeinstitute.org. and see what that broader institute is doing. There's some fascinating stuff around the American dream and everyone's part in it. And we are glad you are part of the Giving Ventures community and invite you to be part of the Donors Trust community if you aren't already. As summer begins to wind down, people start to attend to end of year things, and one of those is often philanthropy. And we would love to be your partner in helping you simplify, protect, grow your charitable giving, and really have the impact for your ideas and your values that you want. You can go to donorstrust.org and poke around there. You can email me directly. Email peter@donorstrust.org. I would love to hear from you. Love your show feedback. Love your ideas for others to talk to. And always there at the end of the line, read everything you send. We will be back in a couple weeks with another great episode. Until then, thank you for being a giver. We'll talk more soon.